Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, House of Delegates Majority Leader Kumar Barve on the politics of Maryland's budget impasse. The most senior member of the U.S. Senate blasts President Bush's Iraq policy as a house of cards. Robert Byrd promises the truth will emerge. In 20 years, the cry in Washington might just be, who lost New Orleans? Author Mike Tidwell on his latest book, Bayou Farewell. Also Cajun music by Squeeze Bayou. What's organized labor to do when the GOP controls the White House and Congress? The AFL's Naomi Walker says, look at the states. Plus, Scottish poet Grant McLeman and local photographer Martin Lueders team up to explore hope and missed opportunities, while Adriane Harjo vents about naming sports teams and cars for Native Americans. Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. It wasn't so long ago that legislators toiling in Annapolis wondered if anyone was paying attention, whether anyone apart from lobbyists even cared what they were doing. Well, that's all changed since Republican Bob Ehrlich was elected governor. Suddenly, Maryland's revenue-challenged state government is a battleground over the budget, slots, and divided government. So what came of the first legislative session since Ehrlich's election? Well, let's ask the House Majority Leader, Kumar Barve, a Democrat from Gaithersburg. Welcome to the Coffee House.
It's great to be here.
Appreciate your coming. The state budget, right now the governor is saying to his agency heads, we got to cut everything by 7.5% or
right.
so.
Even though we don't need to.
Well, let's talk about that. You were quoted as saying that even though the governor vetoed the $150 million corporate tax hike or closing of corporate tax loopholes, still isn't necessary to cut the state budget to the extent that the governor is proposing. Why is that?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's understand that it's really not a tax hike. You know, I've never quoted a Republican governor before, but the Republican governor of Texas said, it ain't a tax increase if you should have been paying it all along. And so what we want is to get a bunch of multi-state corporations to pay the taxes that you and I pay. Now, because the governor vetoed this loophole closing provision, you're right, we're going to have $150 million less in our budget, which means we have to cut spending $150 million. He's proposing to cut spending something in the order of $500 million. Not really sure why. I mean, I'm an accountant, I'm a fiscal conservative, I balance my checkbook every month. You have to achieve a balance, as we have for 40 years, more than 40 years in a row. And
could it be he's looking down the road and saying, well, we're expecting another $1 billion shortfall next year?
Then cut $1 billion next year. If that, you know, look, we're talking about a budget. Right now we're talking about the 2004 budget, the budget that starts on July 1st of this year. And there's no reason for us to start cutting money in anticipation of the 2005 budget, because to begin with, the economy could recover, we could get another shot of cash from the federal government. It's just too soon to eviscerate important programs for kids and for the University of Maryland, for example.
And in addition to simply that $150 million, in your view, not being sufficient justification for this 7.5% cut that the governor is considering, since that time, since the federal government has passed the tax cut bill, more money is going to come into the state government.
One time. We get something like $300 million in one cash hit, and most of that money is going to go to the Medicare program. I mean, the fact of the matter is our health programs, the ones for our parents and grandparents, are in desperate need. And with the federal tax cut that George Bush implemented, Medicare and Medicaid are especially in need. So that money is going to have to go in there. We can't use that money to cut taxes for corporations. We're going to have to use that money for programs that are now under pressure. And you know, let's understand what's happening here. The governor wanted to implement slot machines. He wanted to basically take a couple of racetrack owners who contributed heavily to him and make them into billionaires. And he was angry with the fact that the legislature said, let's stop for a year, let's really study this, let's ask the people of Maryland how they feel about this. Instead, he wanted to charge ahead, we didn't, and I think really this scheme of cutting money more than we need to keep the budget balanced is probably a scare tactic to scare people into supporting slot machines at the tracks.
And is that going to succeed?
Will the scare tactic succeed? Well, gee, I'm scared. No.
The Washington Post reported, based upon their study of campaign contributions or contributions to the efforts in support of slots, that the supporters of slots spent 50 times more than the opponents of slots in the last legislative session. Yet the opponents were able, in lobbying, yet the opponents were able to hold it at bay that time.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, I know the cliche is that money completely runs politics, but let me tell you, nothing beats a good idea or a good argument. And the argument that we made, Speaker Mike Bush and I made in the House of Delegates, was that the worst thing we could do is to implement slot machines based on incomplete information and incomplete understanding of the ramifications of gambling in Laurel, Maryland, and at the Pimlico race course at Rosecroft. The worst thing we can do is rush into a decision that we can't unmake for 20 years. I mean, that bill that the governor proposed would have given a 20-year monopoly franchise to 2 race course owners. And that's a heck of a lot of money to give to somebody simply because they made a lot of campaign contributions.
Well, let's talk about an alternative, which would be to close those corporate tax loopholes. One would be using Delaware as a shell for subsidiaries.
25 other states have done that now.
And others would be to charge a premium on HMOs.
Well, let me explain that. Every health insurance company in Maryland has to pay the 2% premium tax, excepting for the HMO industry. When the HMO industry was started in the early 1970s, it was decided not to charge them that 2% premium tax so that they could get started as an industry, and they've just hung on to that tax break for dear life. It would be a little bit like saying in the automobile industry, everybody has to pay corporate taxes excepting Hyundai. Now, it's, if you made Hyundai pay taxes, maybe the price of their cars would go up a little, but it's just not fair to have a bunch of competitors in a market and have one major competitor be tax-free. It makes no sense.
Well, speaking of the ethical issues involved here, it's been raised as an ethical issue the role of Comcast in all of this. That Comcast, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, has something like 400 shell corporations operating in Delaware as basically places as tax havens. And the governor's wife is a lawyer or has been a lawyer for Comcast. Is there an ethical issue here?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I'll tell, look, I'm the first person to be critical of the governor when I disagree with him, but I really believe we ought to keep Kendall out of this. To begin with, she's not his property. She doesn't do what he says, and I think it's a little sexist to blame him for the job that she has. I don't believe that was at all an issue. If you want to be critical of this governor, there are more than enough things to be critical about without having to deal with something like that.
The new governors, Republican governors of Alaska and Massachusetts, have demonstrated capacity to go directly to the public where they face a hostile legislature. In Maryland, Democrats control both houses by more than a 2-to-1 margin.
Right.
The governor has made soundings that he's going to take the issue of slots directly to the public.
Well, it's a free country. Look, the position that the House take was not a final position of absolutely opposing slot machines. We didn't want this decision to be made without the input of the people of Maryland. We didn't want the decision to be made without looking at other models. I mean, for example, in Ontario, I understand the government owns the slot machines and has a company manage them, and that way they get a lot more money out of the deal. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that, but it seems to me odd that you are basically, I mean, my God, even in Let's Make a Deal, there was curtain A, curtain B, and curtain C. Here we were presented with curtain A and no other alternatives. You can't legislate like that. And again, let's bear in mind, this particular proposal was a 20-year monopoly that would have been outside of government regulation. A generation is a long time to lock in the decision-making of the government.
Let's talk about a few other decisions, vetoes and non-vetoes,
Right.
that bills that the governor signed. He signed a medical marijuana bill, the only Republican governor to sign such a bill.
I applaud him for that.
And he signed an increase in penalties for landowners that illegally fill wetlands. Positive environmental move.
Right.
On the other hand, he vetoed a bill that was quite unexpected from many people. Some people call it the Home Depot bill,
Right.
which would have required more stringent standards for energy conservation from electrical appliances like washing machines. What have you.
Right. Ceiling fans and torchiary lamps. Yeah, that I don't understand why he vetoed that one, because that's one where I believe we'll be able to get a veto override majority in the House pretty easily. I don't know about the Senate. That just makes common sense. I mean, if you can have one electrical appliance that functions as well as another but uses half of the electricity, it makes sense to require that kind of an electrical appliance to be sold in Maryland. Home Depot, I understand, is uncomfortable not with the bill itself. They're uncomfortable with the concept of 50 different states legislating 50 different regulations. I can understand that, but we at the state level have to do it because the federal government will not.
Another area where the governor took what many people are applauding for his stance, which was to support the creation of a commission to study the question of licensing undocumented aliens to get driver's licenses.
Right.
On the other hand, he opposed, he said reluctantly, a bill that would have offered illegal or undocumented aliens who attended high school in Maryland for 3 years in-state tuition for universities.
Do you know that there were a couple of undocumented aliens wearing the uniform of the United States and serving in Iraq? Did you know that? It's amazing, but in this country, America is an amazing country for a whole host of different reasons, but the fact of the matter is, if you live in America and work hard, you have responsibilities, even though you may not be a citizen. And this bill was for kids who had done 3 years of high school and wanted to go to the University of Maryland. The local business community supported this bill because they wanted an educated workforce.
Will it be overridden?
That I don't know.
Well, we'll take a look. Thanks to House Majority Leader Kumar Barve for joining us, and we'll keep an eye on the budget and on the success of both one-eyed and two-eyed bandits in Annapolis. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Promises. In that part of the city that is reserved for Italy, or at least its trappings, I saw her, sipping cappuccino as if she'd invented it, her eyes matching the shade of the cafe's wood paneling, no softer and with a light that defied time. She recalled Aphrodite until she was in the room, and I couldn't share it, only stand outside and wish I was born in a different century. How often do these moments occur in a lifetime? How often do we squander them? How often do we treat them as works of fiction? How often do we let them slip and spiral away? If I see her again, I will try to be part of her day, important, so she remembers with care, care enough to be part of my day and all of my night.
Truth has a way of asserting itself despite all attempts to obscure it. The reality is that sometimes it is easier to ignore uncomfortable facts and go along with whatever distortion is currently in vogue. And we see a lot of this today in politics. Regarding the situation in Iraq, it appears to this senator that the American people may have been lured into accepting the unprovoked invasion of a sovereign nation in violation of long-standing international law under false premises. We were treated to a heavy dose of overstatement concerning Saddam Hussein's direct threat to our freedoms. The tactic was guaranteed to provoke a sure reaction from a nation still suffering from a combination of post-traumatic stress and justifiable anger after the attacks of 9/11. Meanwhile, bin Laden is still on the loose out there somewhere, and Saddam Hussein has come up missing. The administration assured the U.S. public and the world over and over and over again that an attack was necessary to protect our people and the world from terrorism. It assiduously worked to alarm the public and to blur the faces of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden until they virtually became one. What has become painfully clear in the aftermath of war is that Iraq was no immediate threat to the United States, and many of us here said so before the war. Ravaged by years of sanctions, Iraq did not even lift an airplane against us. Saddam Hussein could not even get an airplane off the ground. Iraq's threatening, death-dealing fleet of unmanned drones, about which we heard so much, morphed into one prototype made of plywood and string. Presently, our loyal military personnel continue their mission of diligently searching for weapons of mass destruction. They have so far turned up only fertilizer, vacuum cleaners, conventional weapons, and the occasional buried swimming pool. The Bush team's extensive hype of WMD in Iraq as justification for a preemptive invasion has become more than embarrassing. It has raised serious questions about prevarication and the reckless use of power. Were our troops needlessly put at risk? Were countless thousands of Iraqi civilians, women, children, killed and maimed when war was not really necessary? Was the American public deliberately misled? Was the world? What makes me cringe even more is the continued claim that we are liberators. Vice President Cheney, 3 days before the war started, said, "We will be welcomed as liberators." The facts don't seem to support the label that we have so euphemistically attached to ourselves. Hospitals are stacked with the wounded and the maimed. Historic treasures of the region and of the Iraqi people. Treasures that date back centuries have been looted, and nuclear material may have been disseminated to heaven knows where, while U.S. troops on orders looked on and guarded the oil supply. That's what they were told to do. Meanwhile, lucrative contracts to rebuild Iraq's infrastructure and refurbish its oil industry are awarded to administration cronies without benefit of competitive bidding. And the United States steadfastly resists offers of UN assistance to participate. Is there any wonder that the real motives of the U.S. government are the subject of worldwide speculation and mistrust? We did not complete our mission in Afghanistan because we were so eager to attack Iraq. We could scarcely wait. Now it appears that Al-Qaeda is back with a vengeance. We have returned to orange alert in the United States. We may well have destabilized the Mideast region, a region we have never fully understood. We have alienated friends around the globe with our dissembling and our haughty insistence on punishing former friends who may not see things quite our way. Indeed, we may have sparked a new international arms race as countries move ahead to develop WMD as a last-ditch attempt to ward off a possible preemptive strike from a newly belligerent U.S. bully, which claims the right to hit where and when it wants. In fact, there is little to constrain this president. Congress, in what will go down in eternal history as a most unfortunate and spineless and thoughtless act, handed away its power to declare war for the foreseeable future and empowered this president to wage war at will. Not only this president, but subsequent presidents. And as if that were not bad enough, members of Congress are reluctant to ask questions which are begging to be asked. How long will we occupy Iraq? We have already heard disputes on the numbers of troops that will be needed to retain order. What is the truth? What is the truth? How costly will the occupation and the rebuilding, the reconstruction be? No one has given a straight answer. We cower in the shadows while false statements proliferate. We accept soft answers and shaky explanations because to demand the truth is hard or unpopular or may be politically costly. But I contend that through it all, the people know. The American people, unfortunately, are used to political shading, political spin, and the usual chicanery that they hear from public officials. They patiently tolerate it up to a point, but there is a line. It may seem to be drawn in invisible ink for a time, but eventually it will appear in dark colors, tinged with anger. When it comes to shedding American blood, when it comes to wreaking havoc on civilians, on innocent men, women, and children, callous dissembling is not acceptable. Nothing is worth that kind of lie, not oil, not revenge, not reflection, not re-election, not somebody's grand pipe dream of a democratic domino theory. And mark my words, Mr. President, The calculated intimidation which we see so often of late by the powers that be will only keep the loyal opposition quiet for just so long, because eventually, like it always does, the truth will emerge, and when it does, this house of cards, built of deceit, will fall.
Rained real hard and it rained for a real long time. 6 feet of water in the streets of Evangeline.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the Coffee House. A few years ago, a freelance travel writer got an assignment from the Washington Post to write about Louisiana, as long as it was something other than New Orleans. Little did he realize that the story he found might mean the actual end of New Orleans, at least as we know it. Here's the story. By erecting levees and other barriers to control the Mississippi River, we have messed with the natural depositing of upriver dirt into the bayous. The marshes are now receding and the salty Gulf is pushing northward. The equivalent of Manhattan Island is lost every year. The baseball fields and gardens of Cajun country are sinking. More floods are predictable. As for New Orleans, the land beneath it will someday be uninhabitable, sooner rather than later. It's a stunning story captured in the book Bayou Farewell, the rich life and tragic death of Louisiana's Cajun coast. It's told by Mike Tidwell, and it's all the more stunning because few Americans actually know about it. Welcome back to the Coffee House, Mike.
Thank you, Howard.
It is a terrific book. It's environmental science, I think, in its most readable, personal form. And it started out as a personal story for you.
Yeah, it was. I was asked to go to Louisiana, write whatever I wanted for the Washington Post travel section, and I wanted a fresh way to interpret the Cajun region, that whole lower third of Louisiana, where almost 1 million Cajun people who originally came from France in the 1630s, went to Nova Scotia for 100 years, were expelled by the British and regrouped in what is today Louisiana, and have been there for all these centuries and still speak an archaic form of French as well as Cajun English. I wanted a fresh way to interpret this region, so I decided to just hitchhike on fishing boats through the region and see if it would work, and it did. And I spent weeks and months just going from crab boat to oyster boat to shrimp boat, and telling the lives of these shrimpers.
You were playing Huck Finn in
I was playing Huck Finn. Yeah, I mean, I would just walk up to these bayou is a Choctaw Indian word that means sluggish, slow-moving stream, and so Louisiana is so flat because of the deposits of the Mississippi River. It's the Bangladesh of America, and so you have these rivers, these bayous that begin in the interior of Louisiana and meander slowly to the Gulf of Mexico, and all along them there are these little Cajun fishing towns, and people live right on the water, and they use their boats to get out into the Gulf and into the wetlands, and the bayous are like their roads. And so I said, I wonder if one could just hitchhike on their roads, i.e. on their boats. And it was wonderful because once I would get on these boats and offer myself as a deckhand, it was total cultural immersion. You know, once you get on the boat, you can't get off. You go where they go, you eat what they eat, you talk about what they talk about, you do what they do.
And so, I'm sorry, I was just saying,
yeah.
So what they talked about, the local gossip, was that the bayous were sinking.
Right. I was learning about this wonderful bayou culture where people were still speaking Cajun French and eating these wonderful Cajun meals. The shrimp boats would tie up in this marshland that's as vast as the Everglades and tie up to relax between shrimp runs and cook these great communal meals and play music. And this culture still exists. It's still an isolated, wonderful community of Cajun people. But when I got on these boats, very soon all these salty fishermen started telling me, you know, it's all disappearing. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, all this land is sinking. And that's when I learned about this national calamity that's happening in South Louisiana today.
What made you take it seriously when they said that?
I was fascinated by the story. As you mentioned earlier, an area the size of Manhattan disappears from South Louisiana every 10 months. It's the fastest disappearing landmass on Earth. And these fishermen would say, well, you see that big pond over there? We used to play baseball there. You see this cemetery, literally these tombs. They bury people above ground in South Louisiana. These tombs that were, you know, half underwater, you know, the telephone poles in the water. The land was obviously sinking and disappearing, and it was amazing. And it's sinking because of the leveeing of the Mississippi River. The river no longer deposits its sediments as it did for 7,000 years, and so that original deposits or fine sediment soil naturally compacts over time and subsides, what geologists call subsidence. It's happening to New Orleans as well, and it's disappearing and taking the culture with it.
And so the soil used to be deposited all along the Mississippi, but especially at the mouth. And what you were saying in the book is that now it just flows, the soil that's still in the river flows all the way out and just is dumped into an abyss.
Right. Even at the mouth of the Mississippi, the Mississippi has been locked into a course that takes it to the edge of the continental shelf. And so it just flows, the sediment just flows like a waterfall into an abyss. And there's no land building at the mouth of the Mississippi. And the sides of the edges of the coast are no longer seeing land building because the river no longer floods. And so the land is literally starved for sediment and nutrients. And these vast marshlands, 90% of all of America's salt marshes disappear in Louisiana. Of all the salt marsh land loss in America, 90% of it is in Louisiana.
And this is bad, I say in the introduction. It's creating the barrier, well, it's the natural barriers to flooding are being lost, so that's bad. The culture there, the people there are in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to South Louisiana today and you get outside of New Orleans and you go down into Terrebonne Parish and Lafourche Parish, all these parishes along the coast, which are basically just large wetland counties, you still see that the Catholic churches where the priests come out and bless the boats in this ancient French way. You still see the food, the jambalaya, the gumbo. It really is part of their life. Still, you know, hundreds of thousands of people still speak Cajun French. It's a part of the world. I mean, I've done a lot of travel writing. I didn't know it was possible to really fall off the map in America and travel with people barely recognizable as your countrymen, but it is possible still in South Louisiana. But with the land disappearing, there's this ongoing evacuation from the coast to the interior, and this whole maritime culture is vanishing.
And is anybody doing anything about it?
Well, it can be saved. I mean, if you're going to restore this land, the wetlands that are disappearing, what you have to do is go back to the original source of the land building, which is the great river itself, the Mississippi. And what you have to do is divert the water, the sediment-laden water, out of the Mississippi River in a controlled way back along the coast and replenish these wetlands with fresh sediments. You have to do it without flooding homes and towns. You have to do it without disrupting economic infrastructure like oil and gas fixtures that are down there. And you have to do it without too much environmental damage. And engineers have designed a way where you can put control structures in the levees of the river and let the water out, much like a dam does, in a guided way into the wetlands and save the land and rebuild the land, but it costs a lot of money.
So you mean poking holes in the levees, or?
Poking holes in the levees of the Mississippi River and letting the water flow again, maybe a third or 40% of the Mississippi flow back into the wetlands along, you know, on either side of New Orleans and replenish the land. We won't be able to save all the land that's disappeared over the last several centuries, but a lot can be restored, and what now exists can be saved. And it needs to happen soon. You know, so much has been lost that even New Orleans is very much an endangered city, very much.
And I mean, I had never heard about this. I guess in New Orleans they've heard about it. I mean, you were bringing something to everybody's attention, though, that has essentially been a local story.
I think that the incredible national calamity that's happening in South Louisiana is the greatest untold story in America, which is why I wanted to write the book. I had no idea. When these fishermen told me the land was disappearing and a football field every 30 minutes is disappearing, I had no idea, and the story needed to be told for many reasons. This area is critical habitat for millions of migratory birds. A third of our domestic seafood comes from South Louisiana. Oil and gas infrastructure, critical to our economy, comes from South Louisiana. And the culture. The culture is so wonderful. These people still live in this amazing culture. And it needs to be told, and it hasn't been, and there's a lot of reasons why nobody knows about it. It's an isolated area. The oil companies are implicated in many ways in the destruction of the coast, and they don't want the story to get out. South Louisiana is not near any major media markets. It doesn't have the charismatic megafauna of manatees that the Everglades
have.
have.
But we have to. But saving the Mardi Gras in New Orleans ought to convince enough people.
Yeah, and New Orleans is really in jeopardy. In fact, if nothing's done to divert the river and rebuild the marshes around New Orleans that save it from hurricane surge tides, I really believe, based on my research and understanding of the issue, I'd be shocked if New Orleans is still around in 20 years. I mean,
That's
literally.
20 years. 20 years.
Maybe next year it could be gone. If a Category 5...
Now that is stunning. I mean, that's a stunning...
If a Category 5 hurricane hits New Orleans from the right direction, given the vast disappearance of the wetlands that used to absorb that shock of the surge tide that's now gone, you could have hundreds of thousands of drownings in New Orleans in one day.
Incredible.
And whether they would rebuild after that is open to question. And then the other thing you have, even if New Orleans, Louisiana gets the $14 billion to divert the river,
which is what it would cost.
it would cost about $14 billion, which is not that much given that it's a $100 million industry of fisheries and wetlands and all that. Even if it gets it, there's this other issue that's emerging, and that is global climate change. Sea level is rising because of global climate change, and we could see 3 to 20 feet of sea level rise in this century with enough warming, with ice caps melting, with the water expanding as it warms, that could overwhelm the coast. So we also have to solve this other issue of global climate change.
Yeah, which is a big story, not a local story at all. Well, let me ask you. I'd heard that the governor of Louisiana has also bought your book and is promoting it and selling it or giving it away?
Yeah, the governor of Louisiana, Mike Foster, read the book a couple of weeks after it came out, my book, Bayou Farewell, and loved it and called me up out of the blue and said, Mike, this is Mike Foster, governor of Louisiana. I loved your book. I want you to come down to Louisiana. I want you to be a guest at the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge. I'm going to have a dinner in your honor. I'm going to buy 1,500 copies of the book, give to every member of the Louisiana legislature, every member of Congress in Washington, and President Bush, who's a personal friend of his, because this, he agrees with me, it's the greatest untold story in America.
It is. I mean, we all write books. I mean, not all of us, but you and I write books. But it's not often that that it actually seems like your book may have an impact. I mean, you may help turn around something here.
Well, maybe. I mean, one of the things that's most satisfying about the book is that the book is told through storytelling, and it tells the stories of these Cajun fishermen, and not just Cajun, but Vietnamese and Native American, who all say, look, this land is disappearing, but nobody cares. No one cares about us. And their voices, I try to give them voice in the book. And sure enough, the governor of Louisiana reads it, and he hears their voice. And the next thing I know, I'm having a press conference with the governor of Louisiana in Baton Rouge after being his guest at the mansion. And he's bought 1,500 copies. And the idea that a Southern governor could believe that literature could save his state is very rare.
Very rare. Very rare. Thank you, Mike, very much. Mike Tidwell has written a cautionary tale. Don't interfere heedlessly with Mother Nature. Otherwise, the ground where you're standing may sink slowly into the sea. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
honored? Navajo, Cherokee, Dodge Dakota, Chevy, Cheyenne, Winnebago Chieftain RV? Where is the Zulu pickup truck? Hasidic Honda, Semite sedan, Cholo camper, La Raza? Where are they? 'Cause here I am, still alive in case you've forgotten. And I know that you have. Cleveland Indians, Washington Redskins, Atlanta Braves, chop, 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 woo, woo, woo. Should I feel honored? Funny, I don't. Not with a stadium full of whites, smeared in grease paints, crowned with primary colored turkey feathers. New Jersey Jew boys, Detroit, Dago, Cincinnati Spicks, Nebraska. No? Well, where are they? It's a case of mistaken identity. I'm not a SAG card-bearing Hollywood Indian, but that's me up on the screen, dancing around with Bugs Bunny. Yeah, I'm the fat-bellied moron in a buckskin G-string. Stern arms, crossed over chest, limp frayed feathers dangling from headband hanging over eyes, loosely woven braids over ears, papoose strapped to humpback. Aren't you over it yet? Frito Bandito finally heard the alarm and woke up. Little Sambo finally got long pants and got to grow up, while we are still pictured sitting cross-legged, Indian style, in parking lots full of bigoted cars, drinking firewater, Crazy Horse, malt liquor, Thunderbird, fortified wine. Should I feel honored? Dare I find offense? Senor Speedy Mouse? I ask you, Ms. Jemima, got any clue, buckwheat? Cartooned caricatures. Tell me, Chief, degraded? Honest Injun, dehumanized? Now why should a little squaw like me feel anything but honored? Along with scores of other Indian women raped and mutilated, at least enslaved. Hair scalped off, vaginas carved out, slipped over the saddle horns of those riding off into the sunset. Yippee-ki-yay, away. Away from the living, breathing, writhing, dying, their great-granddaughters barely alive, those survived, but it isn't really what you would call living, now is it? Impoverished, broken treaty reservation lands, oh, it's not Ethiopia or Bangladesh or the outskirts of Korea. It's bi-coastal and renamed plains. It's what used to be my own backyard and what now remains. Not yours, well, now yours. Do you think Sally Struthers will campaign for and save me? Answer my prayers with rice and meal, medical supplies, turn my life around with a mere tax-deductible 45 cents a day, cure poverty, diabetes, give me a lack of lactose tolerable diet without white rice, white flour, white sugar, or cow's milk? Moo, moo, moo. Where's the cure? 'Cause here I am, and oh, great spirit, am I still alive? History books barely mention so. Saturday afternoon cartoons don't say it so. Car manufacturers just won't believe, and neither will dear Walt Disney. And I'm starting to wonder if the authors may be right. Where are they? 'Cause here I am, still alive, even if you have forgotten. And I've come to the understanding that you have.
Hi, welcome to Work Life at the Coffee House. When it comes to cutting taxes, especially for those in the highest income brackets, Congress has been on the job. Never mind the deficits and 3 huge tax cuts in 3 years. But what about legislation to assist working families? It's been more than a decade since Congress passed the Family and Medical Leave Act, and nothing comparable has advanced since, at least not in Washington. But out there in the heartland, things are different, according to Naomi Walker. She coordinates state legislative issues for the AFL-CIO's Department of Field Mobilization. Welcome, Naomi, to the Coffee House, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Fred.
Naomi, tell us why the AFL-CIO and others are spending a lot more time in state legislatures these days.
Well, since the 1990s, Congress has veered increasingly towards the right, and it's been difficult, if not impossible, to get anything passed at the federal level. So we're really looking to the states as a really important battleground. There's been a lot of exciting activity taking place over the past, let's say, 3 to 5 years, I think.
So that shift then this focus has shifted from the federal legislatures to the state legislatures. When again, tell us again when that started to happen?
It was really as Congress became more skewed towards the right-wing agenda and towards the corporate agenda, and several states sort of stepped up to the plate and have worked on some really interesting legislation, anything ranging from affordable prescription drugs to paid family leave to unemployment insurance reform.
So elaborate some more. What other kinds of work and family issues are getting attention in the state legislatures?
Well, certainly this year, the state fiscal crisis has been one of the most important things that the states have been facing. It's the biggest fiscal crisis in the past 60 years, and it's having a huge impact on working family issues. Everything from education to health care to other sorts of programs are being cut, and they're really hitting working families hard. Workers are being laid off, all across the country, and it's been an incredible challenge.
Okay, well, let me see if I can get some more details on the kinds of ways that you've been advocating in state legislatures, and state legislatures have been responding. What about workers' rights issues? Have legislatures begun to focus on some of those issues?
Legislatures have. It's interesting. The union movement has been really fighting to protect workers' rights and has been pushing different types of legislation all across the country. One interesting example is California that passed a bill that would make sure taxpayer dollars aren't used by state contractors to influence whether or not an employee can join a union. And after California passed that bill, New York passed a similar bill, and so it's starting to pick up steam around the country. Several other states have introduced it in the past legislative session.
Well, let me ask you, is this laws which say that employers can't oppose unions?
Well, they don't say that employers can't oppose unions, but they can oppose unions using taxpayer dollars.
So it's the money they get from the state that
Exactly.
they can't use to combat unions.
Exactly.
What about unemployment insurance? This is clearly an issue of very
Right.
great significance and importance to many working families. Has there been any action in the state legislatures on unemployment insurance issues?
The state, across the country, states have really been looking at unemployment insurance reform as a key issue. Given the current recession, there are so many workers out of work. A lot of them aren't eligible for unemployment insurance, or if they do get unemployment insurance, it's not enough to help them pay the bills until they get the next job. So the union movements across the country are working to try to reform that, to make sure that the eligibility rules are changed so more people can receive the insurance benefits, and to raise the benefit levels.
So state legislatures really can affect how unemployment insurance is experienced by working
Exactly.
people.
And actually, the states received $8 billion last year to help improve their unemployment insurance funds. Unfortunately, some of the states, including Maryland, have not taken advantage of that money to improve worker benefits, and a lot of states have actually used the money to cut employer taxes instead of to help workers in this, hard financial time.
Right. I know another set of issues, kinds of issues, involve who gets contracts for state contracts, and that there's movement to try to pass responsible contractor laws. Could you tell us something about that? What are those about?
Sure. The responsible contractor laws basically make sure that any company that gets state subsidies or a state contract, make sure that those companies are playing by the rules, that they're following the labor laws, health and safety laws, environmental laws, and it's a really common sense bill.
So it's a way for states to encourage compliance with basic labor protection laws.
Exactly.
What about in this age of Enron and other kinds of corporate scandals?
Right.
Can state legislatures affect those kinds of issues in any ways?
Absolutely. The corporate accountability is an issue that states have been taking a look at for the past 20 years, and it's starting to actually gain some momentum. The corporate accountability laws that we've been working on make sure that if a state gives a company a tax subsidy or some sort of grant, and the company promises to create jobs, that in fact the company has to create the jobs, or they have to pay the money back to the state. And particularly given that the states are in such fiscal crisis, it doesn't make sense for taxpayers to just sort of throw money at these companies who then are never held accountable for how they spend the money.
So it's taking beyond, in addition to getting protections for workers and communities into the laws, it's making sure that they're enforced and that it actually gets carried through on.
Exactly.
Now, health care is probably one of the biggest issues, if not the most important issue to many working families and to everyone across the land. Is that an issue that state legislatures are getting involved in? And how can a state legislature affect health care policy?
Right. Well, it's interesting. This past legislative session is probably the first time in quite a while that so many states have been working on legislation that would help make sure that uninsured people have more access to health care and that health care is affordable. So right now I think there's 5 states that have introduced legislation like this: California, Maine, Wisconsin, Oregon, and Massachusetts. Maryland also had a bill that would make sure that workers get access to health care. And those bills are still moving through the legislative session. It's going to be exciting to see what happens with those.
So you think there's some real possibilities?
There's definitely some possibilities. In California, the bill has already cleared several hurdles in the state Senate, and they think it's got a pretty good shot.
Well, how have the AFL-CIO and other unions and other allies, how have you been advocating these issues, and what are some of the ways in which you've been making the case for?
Right. Well, I think what's really important is that the union movement can't do this alone. So unions across the country have been really working and building strong coalitions and partnerships with other organizations and advocates in their area. The environmental community, women's groups, interfaith coalitions have become to come together around these really basic issues that impact workers: health care, good jobs, good benefits, and that sort of thing.
Great. Well, tell us, have there been some successes? Have there been some victories that you feel really good about? Tell us about some of the big successes.
Yeah, well, actually, Illinois just passed a corporate accountability bill, just like the one I just mentioned, that requires the state to disclose which companies get the money, and requires the companies to say what they've done with the money, if they've created the jobs that they've said they're going to create, and also if they don't, they're required to pay the state back. And that just happened within the last couple of weeks. So that's, I think, our most recent victory. Earlier this year, California passed a paid family leave bill that would make sure that if a worker needs to take time off to care for a sick parent or a child, or a new baby, that they can take up to 6 weeks off and receive some sort of pay during that time. One of the problems with the family leave bill that passed in Congress several years ago is most families can't afford to just take that much time off without getting any financial incentive. And so California is one of the first states that's actually allowed them to collect some wages while they're off.
Well, those are impressive victories, and it sounds like you're not that far away in some instances of others as well.
Right.
But now tell us, you haven't really mentioned Maryland and the D.C. area and Virginia. Tell us, is there anything going on in the state legislatures or in the district that's of particular interest in this area?
Well, it's been a really tough year in Maryland for working families. The advocates in the union community in Maryland got several interesting bills passed. One would have allowed immigrant workers to get in-state tuition. That passed. The governor vetoed it. The union movement, again working with advocates, was also able to pass a bill that would close corporate tax loopholes, and that would have saved the state, would have put $135 million back into the state coffers. And unfortunately, the governor has vetoed that as well. So, there have been some minor advances, but they've been sort of squashed, I guess is the best way to say it.
Well, that's Maryland. What about Virginia and the district?
Virginia got some improvements in their unemployment insurance system. They were able to increase some benefits, get more benefits for workers who hadn't been receiving them. They also, senior citizens were starting to go back to work, and if seniors are collecting Social Security, they can't collect unemployment insurance if they get laid off. But now, thanks to the work of the union movement there in Virginia, seniors can collect a small portion of unemployment, which will really help them financially. In DC, one of the interesting things is that the city council passed a bill that would make sure that like hotel developers or people running hotels are required to bargain peacefully and fairly with their workers to avoid any kind of strike or boycott. So it's a labor peace agreement.
And I know there are other pending issues here and elsewhere as well.
Exactly.
Well, fascinating. Well, I expect we've only scratched the surface of how state legislatures, with a push from labor and its friends, are trying to address the needs of working families. Thanks to Naomi Walker of the AFL-CIO for your perspective on how these concerns are moving forward. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Work Life.
That's it for this time. See you next month in the Coffee House.
Mister studied algebra in school and got a better job than I could. You take the last couple.
Oh, no, Mister. Stuck in an entry-level job because you only learned basic math. I don't have a boss riding my butt like you do, so you take it so you can get back to your desk.
You know, I probably should, but maybe Miss AP Calculus with the $200 haircut in the big office upstairs would like a cup.
Oh, no, Mr. What was your name again? Never mind, it doesn't matter. I'm too busy doing important things to care. I just came down for some sweet and start.
You know, if my limited math abilities weren't keeping me from getting a better job, I'd quit this afternoon.
I don't blame you. But thank goodness you're stuck here because we really need someone to make the coffee.
It wasn't all that long ago when soil choked the air, cities baked in the heat, and rivers ran out of control. When people went hungry because the crops had failed, when we neglect and abuse the land, the misery follows. What happens on the land, even land we'll never see, affects the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the food we eat. The Arbor Day Foundation reminds you that we need conservation trees. Conservation buffers stop polluted runoff and clean the water. Trees clear the air and help conserve energy. Let's make sure this never happens again. Visit the Arbor Day Foundation website, arborday.org, to find out how to plant and care for trees where you live, in town or in the country.
Plant a tree today for all the world to share.